just give it one more minute as more people are joining in. Thank you. Great. I think we'll start just now. Thank you for joining us, joining this IRMA stakeholder feedback webinar or live consultation event. This is part of a series of topic-specific and thematic live consultations on the new draft standard that IRMA published at the end of October this year. And today we're focusing on land acquisition, displacement, and resettlement processes. And we can go to the next slide. I'll tell you what the agenda is for today. We'll share with you some house rules, remind you how you can, or explain to you how you can contribute today to the standard revision process. We'll say a few words about the revision process itself. And then my colleague, Beth Jean Evans, with me today will be sharing an overview of the proposed changes for this particular chapter. And again, reminding you that today we're talking about land acquisition, displacement, and resettlement. And we will have time for questions and answers and live conversation at the end. We can go to the next slide, please. Great. In terms of the house rules for today, this event is hosted only by IRMA, the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance. It is being recorded, and the recording will be made publicly available on the IRMA website afterwards. I have to remind you that you may not post any unlawful, offensive, threatening, libelous, defamatory, obscene, or objectionable content. Today, you may not post or send or link any hateful, degrading, criminal, or sensitive imagery or content. You can also not advocate or promote intolerance or hate against other people. And we also remind you not to post or send any spam content or content that would attempt to drive attention to unrelated products, services, or initiatives. Why am I saying this? Well, if we go to the next slide, you'll see that today is, if we go to the next slide, please. Today is one of the many communication channels and opportunities that IRMA has set for you to contribute to the IRMA standard revision process. One of the way also being a dedicated online platform that we have developed, you can find online on our website under responsiblemining.net/commons2, the number 2. And today, as ways to contribute directly to the future of IRMA and the development of the new standard for responsible mining and mineral processing, you can either use the chat function, which is enabled today. It's open to anyone. You can use it, and you can share content with us, with the whole audience. But just note that you cannot use it in an anonymous way. So your name will be visible and attributes to your comment. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that you can also use the Q&A function, the question and answers function of Zoom. The button is located at the bottom of your screen. And you can use, again, comment, suggestion, feedback, question, concern, any recommendation to IRMA. I'm already inviting you all to use the chat and the Q&A as of now, in particular for those of you who have already had a chance to look at the draft standard. If you've read this chapter that we're going to present and discuss today, or other chapters as well, please feel free to send your contribution as we go along. And one thing to note with the Q&A function is that you can use it, unlike the chat, in an anonymous way. You just need to tick this option that says send anonymously, and your contribution will be anonymous. If you go to the next slide, to also confirm that all the content that will be shared with us today, so either via the chat or the Q&A function, we will save it and we'll consider it as part of the standard revision process, as with any other communication or contribution channels. This is really an opportunity for you to be part of this revision process. And if we go to the next slide, I'll say a bit more about this revision process, actually. So IRMA has been conducting a comprehensive revision of the IRMA standards. The official IRMA standard for responsible mining was launched in 2018. So it has been 5 years now. And doing this comprehensive revision help us ensure that our system and the standard remains accountable to all sectors, to all stakeholder groups, and to ensure that it also remains aligned with IRMA mission and vision. Doing a revision of the standard offers many opportunities for us and for IRMA. One is to remain up to date, so make sure that the standard is up to date. It's also a moment for us to add clarity, make sure the standard is as clear as possible, it's more accessible for all stakeholders, including to implementing companies and auditors to also strengthen the auditability of all the requirements and the chapters. It is a wonderful opportunity for IRMA to add consistency. And so while reviewing and revising the standard, we have found ways, we think, to better align the structure and make the flows of the chapters more consistent, and also making sure that it's consistent in the way that IRMA embeds into the standard good management systems, practice, and models that are common and recognized. And it's also an opportunity for us to fill gaps. So over the last 5 years, where the IRMA standard may have fallen behind other standards or initiatives, or where a number of issues were previously off the radar or emerging, or actually not addressed and needed at the time. It's also a moment for us to make sure we address all these issues in the new draft standard. And finally, it's also a wonderful opportunity for IRMA to evolve, and we have decided to, and our board of directors has agreed to incorporate key phases of the mineral supply chain. So building upon the IRMA responsible standard for responsible mining that we launched in 2018, that was solely focused and dedicated to mining per se and the extraction of minerals. We have decided to also incorporate 2 draft standards that we published in 2021 that were up until now in a draft format. The IRMA Ready draft standard that covers exploration and mineral development, and the draft standard for responsible mineral processing, which, as it reads, covers the mineral processing phases. And because of the extent and the amount of requirements and issues that are similar and that overlap between all these 3 standards and draft standards, we've decided to unify them and integrate them into one single tool, which is now the draft in its draft format, the standard for responsible mining and mineral processing 2.0, that does cover all the stages from early exploration to development, permitting, to mining and mineral processing operations. Next slide, please. And what is in this new consultation draft? So the new draft standard V2.0, first of all, and this is very important for everybody to know and understand and realize, this is not a final standard that is board approved. It is very much a work in progress document. Our multi-stakeholder, equally governed board has approved to launch this draft as an invitation for comments and as an opportunity for all stakeholders all around the world to contribute and reflect with us on the mechanics, the rationale, and the structure of the standards as well. To make it more meaningful and we hope more user-friendly, we have included in this draft lots of notes. So it makes it quite a long document, but don't be afraid. There's about 50% of it is actually explanation, notes, background, additional information. You'll find them at the beginning of each chapter with a summary of the changes that we're proposing between the 2018 mining standard version and the new draft. And you will also find notes, individual notes under pretty much every single requirement, where again, we're going into detail of why are we proposing these changes, what are they, and are they addressing, one of the four drivers or opportunities that I mentioned before in terms of remaining up to date or adding clarity, adding consistency, or filling some gaps. We have also included in the draft a number of consultation questions. These are in blue text in the draft. And although we are welcoming comments and contributions on everything, really everything is up for, comment and reflection, we have specifically pulled out some key consultation questions where we think some of the most challenging or sometimes controversial issues need to be addressed, and we would really love to have your feedback and comments on. And we'll be sharing some of them in today's presentation as well on this particular chapter. If you're more comfortable with an Excel version, a tabular format of the draft standard, you can also find it on our website. There's an Excel version. And finally, also to let you know, if you haven't seen that the whole draft standard has been translated into Spanish and can be downloaded in either English or Spanish on our website. One slide also to explain very briefly, and I mentioned it before, also in terms of making sure that the new standard remains up to date and is clear. This new draft has been informed by, in particular, the experience that we've been able to build and gather from and through the initial IRMA audit. So you may have seen that IRMA has already published 4 public reports for independent audits that took place at mines that went through the independent IRMA assurance process. We have quite a few more that are now in the pipeline and that are about to be released as public report very soon. So we've also learned, so not only from the 4 that have been published now, but actually more than 12 that are almost finalized, and then another 8 that are also well advanced. So this has been really great for us to strengthen the auditability in particular of the requirements. And we've reviewed, as I mentioned, other standards, laws, initiatives, evolutions around best practice, society's expectations. We've taken into account all the comments that we received between 2021 and now on the 2 draft standards that I mentioned, the IRMA Ready and the draft standard on mineral processing, that do cover these other stages. We've also benefited from our ongoing stakeholder engagement activities and also from the work of a number of expert working groups that were convened and worked on particular issues. If we go to the next slide, I'll be saying just a few words about the consultation period and other ways for you to contribute. This is a 90-day consultation period. We launched the new draft at the end of October. Thus, you have until the end of January to comment. There are many ways to participate. I'll say a few words about them now. But to assure you that all comments will be considered in an equal and objective manner. There won't be comments or contributions that are more important or less important than others. And we'll be very transparent about it. We'll publish a public summary of all comments received once we're done with the public comment period and when we are able to provide explanation and propositions as of how to address them. And finally, I'll repeat it. I said it already, but comments may be treated confidentially. If you want to, just make sure you inform us that you would like them to be treated in a confidential manner. Today, the way to do so would be by using the Q&A function. And again, I'm inviting you again, to start sending questions or comments if you already have on this chapter that we're looking at today. So just a couple more slides on the other ways for you to participate besides this live consultation and the series of live consultations that we have been holding. There's this dedicated online platform that I mentioned, responsibleminding.net/commons2. You can go through every single chapter, leave a comment at all the requirements at the requirement level. And if you'd rather send us more generic or high-level comments, there's also an option at the very bottom of this web page. If we go to the next slide, you see that you can also use more traditional ways and communication channels. We have a dedicated email address. It's comments@responsibleminding.net. You can also use our WhatsApp line or a physical address. And now I'll turn to my colleague Beth to talk us through the proposed changes. Over to you, Beth.
Great, thanks, Pierre. So just a quick review of the objectives and intent of this chapter. It's similar, but slightly distinct from last year. So the objective is to understand past and potential land acquisition and displacement, to avoid displacement and resettlement if that is the most protective option for people. And when avoidance is not the best option, equitably compensate affected people and improve the livelihoods and standards and living of displaced people. The scope of application then is obviously applicable to all of the different phases, and we'll have a slide on that a little bit later on to show. Next slide, please. So I think the major change, and perhaps the most complicated one associated with the chapter in this version, is that there's an increased focus on historical resettlement. So just to give a little bit of context for the motivation for that structural change. Resettlements that have occurred in the past are obviously a particularly challenging scenario from an auditing perspective. And there's a couple reasons for this. One is that many land acquisition processes occurred before the concept of best practice as we know it today had really emerged. So it's a little unfair to hold entities that undertook land acquisition 50, 60, 70 years ago to the same standards as those that are undertaking it today. And there's also obviously logistical difficulties with requiring entities to determine resettlement impacts, in the past. And there's an inability for entities to go back in time and rectify or remediate shortcomings vis-a-vis today's standards. So in recognition of 2006, which I'm sure most people in this call know was when the IFC performance standards was released, the previous version of the IRMA standard did not include any requirements for entities that acquired land, displaced people, or conducted a resettlement prior to 2006. Obviously, under the Human Rights chapter, chapter 1.3, projects had to conduct human rights diligence, and that was to encompass anything associated with resettlement, but there were no resettlement-specific requirements for resettlements for 2006. Next slide, please. So there's a couple issues with this approach that we really thought through a lot when we were putting together this version of the draft, and in conjunction with obviously feedback from our expert working groups. The first shortcoming of this approach was that 2006, kind of emerged as a bit of an arbitrary date. And the reason for this is because international norms surrounding resettlement have really existed, as early as 1980 with the World Bank's operational manual statement, and were reinforced again in 1990 with the World Bank's operational directive on voluntary resettlement. So we started to rethink a little bit the 2006 date as a kind of watershed before which there was no requirements. There was also no due diligence requirements for resettlements before 2006, again, outside of the human rights chapter. So what this meant is there was a potential that projects that had conducted land acquisition or resettlement prior to 2006 could actually obtain a high achievement level in IRMA despite having knowingly or unknowingly potentially committed human rights abuses and other impacts in contradiction with the spirit of IRMA. And this also put undue pressure on auditors to verify if resettlement was not relevant, as chapters, as we all know, can be marked not relevant, or if human rights abuses occurred, because it really meant that in absence of due diligence, an explicit requirement for that, Auditors had to independently identify and interview displaced populations, which by definition are no longer in the project area. And they also had to conduct independent research into land acquisition processes with little information to guide them. So these were the three kind of challenges that we went into this version of the standard trying to address. Next slide, please. So arising out of these challenges, there was a couple proposed changes. So the first change that we're proposing is that all entities conduct land acquisition due diligence to demonstrate chapter relevance or lack thereof, and the absence or presence of human rights abuses. And the reason again for this is that it's not feasible for auditors to independently investigate claims. And so we're asking the entities provide auditors with supporting evidence to be able to evaluate claims that a chapter is not relevant and that there were no human rights abuses associated with any displacement. Next slide, please. Here's where things get a little complicated. And I'm going to actually post in the chat to everyone. So we've essentially decided to propose a 2.4a and a 2.4b. So the link that I just put in the chat is a helpful way to look at it because it shows the two, I guess, sub-chapters if you want to refer to them that side by side. So you can see where requirements align and where requirements have been altered and where they just simply don't exist for 2.4b. So I'll explain that over the next couple of slides, but just for those of you who prefer to see a comparative version, it's in the chat. And I'd ask Pierre to make sure that that link works, please. So 2.4b is a subchapter that's designed to apply to circumstances resettlements happened in the past. And I'll be specific about what we mean by the past in a second. And so this is distinct from requirements in 2.4a that apply to land acquisition that happened in the recent past, post-2012, or the future, post-2024, or the release of this proposed version of the IRMA standard. Hopefully this will make a little bit more sense on the next slide. Can you just go through, bring up the whole timeline, please? Thanks. Okay, perfect. So essentially, this is a graphic depiction of what we are proposing with respect to the structural changes in this chapter. And again, this is designed to better address historical resettlements, being those that occurred before 2012, which again was the release date of the IFC performance standards that most people see as kind of the landmark for best practice at the moment. So again, chapter 2.4b on this timeline here is for historical processes. And there's a specific set of requirements associated with that are focused more on remediation and flexibility, recognizing that it could be a 2011 resettlement or it could be a 1911 resettlement. So there's flexibility and a focus on remediation built into those criteria. Chapter 2.4a is for, we'll call it recent historical or proposed or planned resettlements. So in scenario 2, well, let's jump to scenario 3. This is for new resettlements. After 2024, after the release of the standard, it will be the full chapter and entities will be required to meet all of the requirements in it. Scenario 2 is slightly modified. I think there's only proposed 2 requirements that entities can essentially be exempt from if they conducted the resettlement between 2012, again, the release of the IFC performance standards and the release of this new version of IRMA. And the reason, the motivation for having this scenario 2 is that we've included some requirements in this version of the chapter, which although they're arguably now representative of best practice, in 2012, they were not. So in recognition that IRMA is kind of codifying things that are now best practice and pushing the envelope a little bit, the general feedback we received is it's not fair to hold entities who might have conducted a resettlement in June 2012 to the same standards. So I'll highlight which are the requirements that are essentially optional for sites that conducted displacement or resettlement between 2012 and 2024. And again, in the comparative version, in all versions, actually, they're very clearly highlighted in the notes section. And there's consultations, questions associated with whether or not these should be optional for sites in this kind of recent historical scenario 2 phase. I hope this component has made sense. We're happy to elaborate again, because I know it is a little bit convoluted unless you've had a lot of time to read through the standard. Next slide, please. So arising out of this, and one of those requirements that is optional under scenario 2 that I referred to, is that we are proposing to add a requirement relating to voluntary displacement. I'm sure most of you know the IFC standards are specifically aimed towards requirements around involuntary displacement. Involuntary displacement obviously being displacement that occurs in countries in which the entity would ultimately have recourse to expropriation should negotiations fail. So we are proposing a requirement 2.4.7.9, which actually, imposes some standards on entities with respect to voluntary land acquisition as well. Next slide, please. For those of you who have been following the consultation process more broadly, last week, I believe it was, we presented a proposed chapter on gender, which was not included in its entirety as a separate chapter in the previous version of the IRMA standard. So in keeping with that spirit, we've also included a requirement in the resettlement chapter that entities consider gender equity in compensation and livelihood efforts. For those of us who are resettlement practitioners, this is already something I'm sure most of us do, but it was not an explicit requirement in the previous version of the standard, and now it is. Next slide, please. Another kind of new requirement that we're proposing is avoidance of temporary transitional displacement. So temporary transitional displacement is when an entity, typically for the purposes of expediting project development, will displace individuals to temporary residences, temporary locations, while their permanent residences are being constructed or while a permanent solution is being put together. So this essentially results in double displacement and is, not generally considered something that is ideal for the affected persons, as it's doubly disruptive to their lives. So we have proposed, and obviously would love to hear feedback on the necessity of this criteria, but we've proposed a criteria stating that entities should only engage in temporary transitional displacement, or if you want to think of it as double displacement, under very specific situations and conditions. Next slide, please. So as we said at the beginning, this is 2.4A in particular, and 2.4B is on the next slide, but it is applicable in various ways to all of the stages. And if you want to look at the full document, it's available on the IRMA website under resources. And the next slide, please, just shows the equivalent for 2.4B, which is again focused on historical land acquisition. Next slide, please. So just an overall summary to give you an idea of where we've gone with it in terms of the number of requirements. In the 2018 standard, again, there was only one chapter and it contained 28 requirements. In the draft standard that we're discussing today, 2.4A, the full version of it for post-2024, post-release of this version of the standard, has 32 requirements. So a couple new requirements in there, but of course there's been a lot of changes in terms of combining requirements and separating some requirements out. So it's not simply just the addition of 4. There are some broader changes there. 2.4A, which is recent historical between 2012 and 2024. So that scenario 2 that we saw on the timeline, very similar to 2.4A, as I mentioned. There's 30 requirements plus 2 that are currently proposed as optional. And then 2.4B, which is for historical resettlements prior to 2012, there's 21 requirements. Next slide, please. So consultation questions. And again, we're happy to receive feedback on any component of the chapter of the standard as a whole. But these are a couple things that have really, stood out to us as challenging and that we'd love to get feedback on. So the first one, obviously, we are proposing an entirely new approach that has a wider scope, but also offers more clarity between historic and proposed land acquisition and resettlement. So this broader division into 2.4A and 2.4B with the focus on historical, recent historical, we would love to get any feedback on, on either that as a general concept or on the particular requirements contained within either one of those chapters, subchapters. Next slide, please. A little bit more on the temporary transitional resettlement, and the requirement that there's very specific sets of measures and mechanisms to be implemented if this is unavoidable. So again, setting conditions under which this should occur and laying out how it should be done. Yeah, we're interested in knowing if this is an issue that needs to be explicitly addressed, and if so, what the content of the actual requirement should be, whether it's what we proposed or if there's additional more specificity, less specificity that we should be incorporating into that requirement on this concept of temporary transitional resettlement. Next slide, please. Again, back to voluntary resettlement, and this was, a hot topic in our expert working groups that we held. So criteria 2.4A79 proposes that all entities have to at least identify and map land occupants affected by voluntary, and yes, intentionally in quotations, land transactions, and that consultation decision-making processes are free and informed, and that transactions are documented and compensation associated with voluntary land transactions is fair. Next slide, please. So again, any feedback on the content of that, whether or not we should be going further or not quite as far in terms of requirements for voluntary resettlement, because again, it is a bit of a divergence from what resettlement practice currently focuses on, which is largely on involuntary displacement, involuntary resettlement. And in a similar vein, this scenario 2 recent historical between 2012 2024, this is one of the criteria I mentioned from which we are proposing that sites can be exempt if the resettlement was conducted between these years, because again, using 2012 as a guideline and what was codified as international best practice under the IFC standards, this is not explicitly not included in the IFC standards, at least not to the extent that involuntary displacement is. So then our question is, do you think that 2.4.7.9 should be applied retroactively to all voluntary land acquisition processes between 2012 and 2024? Or put differently, do you agree that entities, or do you think that entities should not be exempt from this requirement in the updated standard? So basically, should entities be held to certain requirements post 2012 as opposed to post 2024? Was it generally enough accepted as international best practice in 2012, despite it not being part of the IFC, that really entities should be held to some sort of standard with respect to voluntary, is essentially what that consultation question is getting at. Next slide, please. Taking voluntary even further, like I said, it was a very hot topic. Should IRMA go further than the proposed 2.4.7.9 for entities undertaking land acquisition after the release of the IRMA standards? Now, we're not asking if this requirement for voluntary should be applied to recent historical 2012 to 2024. Now we're asking if new proposed resettlements that are occurring after the release of this standard, whether all land acquisition should be treated as, quote, involuntary, regardless of whether or not it's involuntary according to IFC definitions, i.e. the entity has recourse to expropriation, or voluntary being willing buying seller moving forward. So I think it's a very interesting question, and we would particularly love to have feedback on this from the group here and anyone else who's familiar with this subject, as it is a complicated question, but a very important one. Next slide, please. Another challenge that we came upon in terms of historical processes, so it's taking a step back now to looking at resettlements that were done before 2012, could have been 50, 60, 70 years ago. Obviously, a key point that was brought up in the working groups is that it may be very difficult for some entities to conduct due diligence if a lot of time has passed since their land acquisition, or if they were not the owners of the operations at the time that land acquisition was conducted, et cetera, et cetera. But nevertheless, due diligence has to be robust. There are obviously perverse incentives for entities to claim that they tried really, really hard to find information on their land acquisition and they just couldn't. So we obviously want to avoid a situation in which they just absolve themselves of it because they couldn't find, quote, could not find any information. But that asks the question of what criteria should be considered when evaluating the robustness of due diligence. So some suggestions that have come out in the working groups are looking at what sources the entity used to attempt to determine historical events, were interviews conducted, were local authorities involved, were notices posted in relevant communities soliciting information if relevant, are there record-keeping timeframes by law that limit access before a certain period, et cetera, et cetera. So essentially what we're looking for here is what guidance should we be offering auditors in terms of determining whether an entity has conducted a robust enough due diligence in order to determine past impacts of land acquisition and displacement, because obviously those past impacts have implications for their obligation in subsequent requirements to conduct remediation. So it's, again, recognizing the need to be flexible with the availability of information if it was an extremely long time ago, but also wanting to avoid perverse incentives where entities just say we couldn't find anything. And by definition, then don't have anything to remediate. So any input onto how to strike that balance would be super helpful. Next slide, please. That's it for the content slides. Pierre, back
Yeah,
over.
thank you. Thank you so much, Beth. As you said, and I'm not sure this is a complicated, but this is quite a complex structure and change that we're proposing. So we'd really love to, hear from you all on what Beth has just explained and presented. And again, inviting you all to use the chat function or the Q&A function today to share comment and content with us. I guess to get us started, Beth, a question that we hear, I think, often, and I actually heard it again yesterday in the context of a Western African country. There are often informal benefits that may be no longer available once a community has been displaced, and that would not be taken into account and calculating compensation. For example, often we hear that especially women from the communities have access to a forest area where they can harvest and pick fruits or berries, or there are also members of the communities who could go and chop down some wood and then sell it to the local market. So all this kind of informal activity very often gets off the radar. And I don't know if is this something we can explain how it's been taken into account, or is this part of the proper due diligence and the management plans that need to be put in place? That's one thing. Another thing that I think we also hear very often is around the compensation levels. And very often, I think you've experienced that firsthand, Beth, when populations who have been displaced say that they've not received, enough money to ensure their livelihoods is sustainable, or that they can, sustain their living and working conditions. And I guess a question to us, where I think we'll be able to answer, does the IRMA standard set minimum compensation levels or equivalent? How does standard work, and what is best practice when sometimes the calculation methods in some countries it's in the law or in the regulation, but it's completely outdated. They haven't been updated for 15, 20, 25 years. And even when they are, sometimes it's not necessarily adequate. So if you can, help us maybe address some of these questions while again the audience is thinking about it and maybe sharing more comments and questions.
Yeah, definitely. So there's a couple pieces there. I'm going to start with the last one because I remember it the best, and then remind me of the ones at the beginning after, please. So there is a question about adequacy of compensation. Obviously, this is a very hot topic for those of us who are resettlement practitioners. And obviously, it's for communities, it's one of the most critical factors. So the concept of full replacement costs, which for those of you who are not familiar with it, is essentially saying, take structures, for example, the cost to rebuild a structure as new in current market conditions without incurring any additional transactions, fees, et cetera, et cetera. So basically everything is covered, and a person losing their home could rebuild that exact home if it meets minimum standards, or if it doesn't meet minimum standards, it could rebuild a better home without incurring any personal costs. So essentially compensation should cover the full value of replacing an asset in current market values. Of course, there's always issues with, particularly in resettlements where government is either leading the resettlement or highly involved in controlling rates that can be paid for certain things. Like you mentioned, the rates might be 10 years old, they might not be adjusted for inflation, they might be including depreciation, or we might just have absolutely no idea where the rates are coming from, which also happens. So yeah, the standard is very specific, and we'll add in notes in the guidance notes that compensation does have to, one, be negotiated with the community so that everyone can be sure that it is appropriate to cover costs, and getting the community's understanding of what additional costs, besides just buying materials and construction to rebuild houses, are going to be involved. But that it does need to cover their costs in their entirety using the notion of full replacement value. So yes, compensation is a very, very critical component of resettlement, but we do have some safeguards built in there to make sure that minimum requirement of full replacement cost is met. And Pierre, what was the first question you had asked about?
Yes, I think it's strongly connected. But the
Informal
first
autonomy.
question was around, yes, any informal activities, benefits from either the original area where people are being displaced from or expropriated, that may, again, fall off the official government radar, but also when doing these initial due diligence or calculation that you're mentioning, that is, I think, very strongly embedded in a sort of human rights, fundamental rights approach, rather than, complying with what the law requires. It can be very challenging. So again, from your experience and from an IRMA standard perspective, if there's any guidance or additional explanation that may be helpful.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the basic way to do resettlement, which is not reflected in our standard, thankfully, is to say, here is the cost of your asset, and take the cash, and we're done here. So that is not at all what we're proposing in the standard. Thankfully, there's a lot of safeguards, again, built in that we're proposing for things obviously formal in informal economy. So for economic displacement, looking at actual, formalized jobs, but informal jobs, people selling on the side of the street, people who collect non-forest benefits, so berries, firewood, anything that might be coming out of a forest that they might even be using for subsistence. So again, there's guidance in there that subsistence use needs to be considered, and not just cash use of products collected or crops grown, and also considering things such as cultural heritage impacts is, a definite part of any good resettlement action plan as we've written it into the proposed standard. And also considering things like implications for social networks. Things like cultural heritage and social networks might not necessarily result in a monetary compensation, but they would definitely, fall under other requirements in the standard, wherein the entity has a responsibility to, take these things into consideration, especially when picking resettlement sites and on, deciding in conjunction with the communities where they want to go and how they want their future lives to be post-resettlement. So the standard does require the informal and formal economy taken in consideration. And it also requires looking into things like social networks, the availability and access to resources, and things relating to cultural heritage as well. Again, not necessarily from a monetary transaction compensation perspective, but from a planning perspective, wherein these things need to be essentially considered and reinstated to the extent possible if the resettlement is to be considered done well and to meet many of the requirements of IRMA.
Yeah, thank you, Beth. This is very, I think, clear, and it talks really about the, I think, the thoroughness and the robustness of the standard. It's also, I guess, a good link to something that we've been saying and that we've said in other live consultations and on other topics and chapters, that it's really important to not see and read these chapters in a siloed way or like completely separated out. Like, okay, I need to look at, resettlement one day, and then another day I'll be looking at human rights due diligence, and then the third day I'll be looking at environmental and social impact assessment. There are strong connections and cross references and interdependent requirements. I guess that's probably the most important thing here when it comes to, the things you've mentioned, especially around cultural heritage. We haven't mentioned it here in the presentation, but there are also a number of requirements that are specific to the presence and the rights of indigenous peoples, in particular the free, prior, and informed consent, but also other fundamental rights. That is very important, I think, to look from or to read and implement from sort of bigger picture or bird's eye view perspective. So that's maybe one thing you want to comment on. And the other thing I wanted to mention is also around cultural heritage, and you mentioned it. It's something that we hear very often, and unfortunately, this is a very common issues where places of worship or cemeteries are destroyed or gone, and this doesn't happen through a proper process. I think this links also very strongly to other chapters in the IRMA standard, where there are a number of situations where best practices actually would be to rescale the project or do it differently or implement it in a different way rather than, which is unfortunately also a very common practice, to see all community perspective and stakeholder perspective as a barrier that you need to get through, but rather see it as an opportunity for constructive engagement and meaningful and collaborative discussion, planning, design, and operation.
Mhm. Yeah, I think your point about the interconnectedness is important, because there are a lot of other chapters that speak to, well, all of the chapters, a common theme is the participatory process, right? So when we're talking about what type of informal and formal labor exists, how it should be compensated, what the cultural heritage impacts are, what the social networks are, obviously that's not for the auditors to determine. So both within other chapters dealing with stakeholder engagement, but also within this chapter, I think there's some very robust participatory processes built into there that will allow auditors to understand what the community thought was important, what the community valued, and whether and how that was reflected by the plans and procedures that the entity undertook. So I think that that's, a really important component of this standard. And it was present in the previous version as well, but it's been strengthened here, I think, a little bit with respect to ensuring that the participation of women who a lot of times are engaged in informal labor, as we were discussing before, being able to ensure that their informal labor is recognized and it's compensated. And if they gather non-timber forest products from a nearby forest, that it's important that the resettlement, either reestablish their ability to do that post-resettlement, or that they provide, a viable alternative for the women or for, youth or whoever else is involved in that process. But without the consultations to identify that more kind of informal household level economy, and without that input from the stakeholders, the entity's unlikely to know that, and they're unlikely to incorporate it into their plans, and then they're unlikely to meet the relevant IRMA requirements on it. So I do think, they go hand in hand, the conceptual approach to what is included in compensation, but also the robust participatory process that allows entities and then subsequently auditors to really understand things from the community perspective, because that is the objective here. I think also to your point about cultural heritage, it's a similar vein, right? Allowing the communities to determine what is most important for them. And I do want to highlight as well, this makes me think, I had mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that there's a slight change in the objective from last year. So I'm not sure, Alan, if you can actually put that slide back up, but since we have a moment here, I think it's important to highlight. It's very subtle, but it is, I think a marked change from previously. So that slide essentially said that the objective was to understand past and potential land acquisition, avoid displacement resettlement, if that is the most protective option for people. So it's that hidden little phrase there that I want to highlight here, because it is a marked change from both the previous version of the standard and also from I think what IFC guidance generally tells us by most interpretations is that avoiding resettlement is always the best option, and leaving people where they are is always the best option. So feedback from our working group is that it's not necessarily always the best option, and that resettlement should only be undertaken if it is in fact the best option, and if people themselves also agree that it's the best option for them. So not operating on an assumption that leaving people 3 feet from the edge of a project boundary is necessarily the best option for them, given, various risks and whatnot that can be associated with that, and disruptions to their lives, especially in things such as social networks. If you're moving 3/4 of a village, and that's highly disruptive to social networks, just the fact that you can, quote, avoid moving that other quarter of the village doesn't necessarily mean by definition is the best thing to do. And I think that there's been, in practice, historically, there's been a little bit of an emphasis on, and understandably so from a financial perspective, but the fewer people you can displace, the better. So what we're doing with that little statement there is we're trying to, proposing to interrogate that question a little bit, and taking into consideration the actual desires of communities, and also, whether it is actually in their best interest, instead of just assuming that staying is always the better option. And obviously another question that raises is, and we have not explicitly addressed it, but of course, we'd be happy to receive feedback on it, is if people should have the right to ask to move. So for example, if technically according to the ISHA and technically according to the RAP, they don't have to move, but they nevertheless find that, and sometimes it might be something that doesn't resonate with our understanding of science, but proximity to a certain project might have cultural implications or health implications, again, that don't resonate necessarily with Western understandings of science. But do those people have a right to request to be moved, even though the ISHA and the RAP may say they're technically not impacted? If they themselves perceive there to be impacts, do they have a right to request to be resettled as a result of the project? So lots of interesting questions that we have addressed in the draft for the most part, and we look forward to further elaborating based on feedback that we received from people in this call and through the other channels that Pierre mentioned, and obviously including lots of guidance in the guidance note for auditors to make sure that everybody's aligned.
Right, thank you, Beth. And yeah, so taking I think the few minutes that are left to again invite everybody on the call to send additional questions or comments or concerns. Also, if you've had experience with the current 2018 version of the standard. I don't see many more questions at the moment. Maybe there are 2 issues that we can address briefly. One, I think is again similar to what you discussed about the sort of interconnection with other chapters, but in the new draft standard, we've also tried to strengthen a number of requirements and topics in the context of climate change. I know this is it's not explicit at the moment in this chapter, and it's actually one of the consultation questions that we have for you all, whereas we'd need, or we should, to include specific climate resilience or climate adaptation requirements or sub-requirements. So it again, if Beth, you want to say something about it, and then finally, if we have more time, I'd be curious from your own experience, also as a practitioner, as an auditor, if you've seen situations with some very old historic like resettlement land acquisition processes, as the one you mentioned. Sometimes it could have happened 50, 60, 70 years ago, and all the challenges that you mentioned on it might be like an entire new or generation or second, third generation of impacted populations. It's hard to follow their trace, know where they've moved, migration waves, etc. If you have any successful examples or practical examples that you'd like to share with us, again, and within the very short period of time that we have left ahead of us. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. So just to elaborate a little bit for everyone, on the climate change adaptation resilience piece, yeah, I think it's come up in our working groups, in several, not just in the resettlement working group, but in several working groups, what types of future considerations should be made. So currently in the standard, we make references to things such as livelihoods programming has to be sustainable. We talk about post-closure, et cetera, et cetera. But as Pierre mentioned, we don't explicitly discuss climate resilience in the context of this resettlement chapter. So we, of course, be interested in knowing from any of you whether or not that explicitness is necessary, and if so, what form it should take. But to just give, one example jumps to mind, and it could be arguably encompassed in this concept of sustainability. But if we're talking about economic displacement and the provision of replacement agricultural lands, I think it's important to be able to understand their viability. And obviously that's common practice right now. If they're planting corn here, can they plant corn there? It's a common question. But I think the climate change component of it would be saying, not can they plant corn there next season, but can they plant corn there in 10 years? And to what extent is their ability to plant corn there, or possibly a slightly more climate sensitive crop, to what extent is that being impacted by climate change? Of course, that brings into questions of how far into the future should entities have to look, given unreliability of models, et cetera, et cetera. But should it at least be an explicit part of livelihoods planning or of any type of resettlement planning, that the entity should have to be looking into what is required from a climate adaptation perspective, and whether and how that should be incorporated into the resettlement planning, as well as planning for operations more generally. So I think that would be a question that would be super interested in having feedback from people on, especially if anyone is particularly well versed in the realm of climate change adaptation and climate change resilience. Pierre, remind me, sorry, your second point?
Yeah, but if you have any examples or particular success stories, but also, if you want to explicit some of the challenges with real first-hand experience when it comes to land acquisition process that took place 50, 60, 70 years ago.
Yes,
if you can.
Yeah, definitely. So in terms of successful experiences, they're tough. They're very, very, very tough. From an auditing perspective, maybe not something that was done 20, 30 years ago, but if you're looking at something that was done in the early 1900s, you're dealing with several generations now of displacement. So first of all, disbursement, particularly if it wasn't well done, people were either probably just kicked off their land or maybe given a minute amount of money, scattered probably to capital cities if it was available to them, with no stakeholder engagement, little tracking of who went where and what. And this is all exacerbated when we're talking about informal land users, because there wouldn't even be any registry of them having been on that land at all in the first place. So obviously some of that, depending on how long ago, can be mitigated through interviewing local populations, through doing maybe, obviously satellite imagery wasn't a big thing, I don't think, in the early 1900s, but to the extent possible, being able to see population migration, word of mouth through communities, to try to track these people down. So I think that's the first challenge with a historical resettlement, and is finding out what the impacts actually were. I think it can be very, very difficult, particularly in the case of informal land users. And then once you've identified them, then you're faced with a whole different realm of problems in that, what do you do? How do you determine what is appropriate compensation or remediation for somebody's great grandfather being kicked off the land 70 years ago? It's extremely, extremely complicated and extremely difficult. And understanding the need to not open up a can of worms and just start throwing billions of dollars around, but also, recognizing particularly where human rights impacts have occurred, and, what have the impacts been over time, over generations, and coming up with a way to, I think maybe remediate is probably a better word, in this case, than compensate, those impacts and help the communities out or help the individuals out in a way that, you know, is sustainable and makes sense and is proportionate to the impact. But again, extremely difficult when we're talking about historical resettlements to do that. And I think that's why we've proposed the standard as we have proposed it, with recognition of that built in, and, you know, encouraging entities and laying out standards for entities to do the best that they can in trying to identify the impacts, and also in providing some guidance on what remediation should and could look like, acknowledging that, you know, we couldn't go too far with respect to prescribing what remediation should look like, because it's extremely dependent on the individual context. But I do hope that in this proposed chapter, we've struck the right balance of holding sites accountable for displacement associated with projects where, even if they weren't the owner at the time, they're still profiting from displacement that occurred in the past. So there is a need to hold them accountable, but at the same time recognizing and, you know, incorporating some flexibility and recognition of the fact that it is extremely difficult when we're talking about things that happened a long time ago.
Thank you so much, Beth. And with that, I think we'll close the session for today. So I'll thank you all for participating, listening. I'm inviting you all again to, you know, look at the draft standard, either this chapter, but really as a whole, if you can. The public comment period is open until the end of January, and we're very much looking forward to receiving and reading all your contribution. And I'll thank my colleague Beth and Alan for their support today. The recording will be available on our website afterwards, and I wish you a good day. Take care.
Yeah.